Okay, we would like to welcome Howard Clark to this Mujer Palabra interview. Howard Clark at present is the chairperson of War Resisters International, an international mutual support network of activists using nonviolence to strive for social change. And he's an experienced thinker and activist in the world of pacifism. He has traveled the world and met and worked with all kinds of activists confronting all kinds of violence. And he has written books about some of those issues. Howard lives in Madrid, and he became a father when he was 50, and he loves singing too. So, well, welcome, Howard. I would like to ask you, first of all, why did you become a pacifist? How did that happen?
Well, it happened when I was 18. I fell in love with someone whose father had been a conscientious objector. And so we got talking about that in a way. Being English, I was never subject to conscription myself. I never had to make a decision about joining the armed forces, but her father, he had been a conscientious objector in the Second World War. He had, and she talked about what it was like for her family there, and it made me start thinking about it. And I, up to that point, had taken the position that I was against nuclear weapons, I was against wars like the Vietnam War that was happening at the time. But in some extreme cases, I thought probably it was necessary to take up arms. And she said, but do you think you can decide that? Do you think you can know what is an extreme case? And do you think you can make that judgment? And I thought, well, there are just too many unknowns. You're right. I can't make that judgment. And then I began thinking more about it and realised that each of these extreme cases that happens when people think war is justified actually could have been prevented. And what's happening is that people are always preparing for the next war, or always preparing for war, and then never developing the alternatives for war, never following the policies that would prevent war. And so one war serves to justify the next war. And each time that people make the decision, oh, this is an extreme case, there is nothing to be done, then nobody is experimenting with an alternative. And so I decided that I was going to commit myself to not just to opposing war, but to developing nonviolent action. Wow.
That was a real good decision.
As I said, I became a pacifist when I was 18, which was just before I went to university. And I went to university in 1968, which was quite a good year to go to university. And I became an activist as a student and very involved as a student. And I sold a weekly paper called Peace News. And I actually used to spend half my life carrying it around the place. So it was a huge part of my identity for people. Here's a Peace News seller coming, you know, he's got this bag full of this paper to sell. So I was involved in things there, the Biafra War, the struggle against apartheid. I'm British, and Britain had very strong connections with South Africa, and also the Vietnam War was going on, and we had a case of an American student, a US student, who was found smoking an illegal substance and was going to be expelled from the university and therefore sent back to the United States, where he would have been liable for the draft. So suddenly a whole load of issues came together, and we had a major campaign there. And I was writing all this up for Peace News, and when I left, when I graduated from university, Peace News offered me a job. So I actually had the luck that very few Spanish people ever have of working full time for peace and for reporting on non-violent action and actually initiating campaigns. I had the luck to do that as a paid job.
Wow.
It wasn't paid very
much. That's why you write so well. And that's why you're such a good organizer.
I was doing that when I was, so I started there when I was 21, yeah. And Peace News was affiliated to War Resisters International, so in 1972 I went to my first War Resisters International conference, which was in England, and that really began my involvement. I just met people who I'd read about or sometimes even written about from all over the world, people who'd been involved in the civil rights movement in the United States, in the movement against the Vietnam War. I was very influenced by some Vietnamese Buddhists who I met, and then I suppose it's very difficult to maintain an international involvement, and once I left Peace News, I was involved in things in Britain in anti-nuclear energy campaigning, or safe energy campaigning we called it, because we wanted to give it a positive twist in a community paper where I lived, in an anti-sexist group. We used to go into schools to raise issues of sexism with secondary school pupils and so on. And it wasn't until 1985 that I got involved with War Resisters again, when a job opening came up to be in the War Resisters International Office in London, and I was actually at that time working as an assistant to someone who had previously been the chair of War Resisters International, Michael Randle, and he told me about this job, and I just thought that is too good an opportunity to pass up, and I applied for it, and and that really just changed my life. It was such a privilege working there in that period as well, from 1985 onward. The first year I started working there, I think two particular struggles really swept me up. One was the end conscription campaign in South Africa had started, and this combined the issue of apartheid, which I'd been working on and off, and with anti-militarism, and I met some of the people from the end conscription campaign. I organised a speaking tour for them. I got them to come to the conference that we held that year, at the end of that year, in India, and that was just fantastic. They weren't actually pacifists. They were opposed to apartheid. They were opposed to conscription, so they were anti-militarists. But they would not. They did not oppose the armed struggle of the ANC, or some did. Some were pacifists, but as an organisation, the end conscription campaign contained a mixture of people, and they couldn't talk very openly about it either, because they were operating in a borderline situation where sometimes they were actually banned, quite often they were illegal, so they had to be very careful about what they said. And so that was one situation. Then the other was in Poland. At the time, I was going out. I was living with a Polish woman. I mean, who I live with, where my heart goes, has influenced my life quite a lot. And we went to Poland that summer for a holiday, and I met some of the people in the Freedom and Peace group there, which was a new group formed that year, which was combining the issues of human rights, which was very common in the Soviet bloc at that time, that people would take up human rights, but they were combining it with peace, which was seen as a kind of Western dissident issue. It was seen as a state discourse by some people there. So to have independent people combining human rights and with peace was a very subtle challenge to their state, and they were opening spaces, and they kept a weird timetable because partly as a legacy of martial law when there were curfews and so on, and so they would have meetings that went on all night, and by all night I don't mean till 11 o'clock, I mean starting at 11 o'clock and going on all night. It never ended, and then you know, getting up very late in the day and all this sort of thing, and they were taking risks, but they were doing things that people thought were crazy. They had the analysis that Solidarność had tried to create a trade unions where trade unions were not allowed, and this had got the government to bring in martial law, and they thought, well, hang on, we need to actually start questioning the military, which was a very, very honoured institution in Poland. And so they began by first refusing the military oath and then actually refusing military service. And they invented forms of action. Every good movement invents new forms of actions. They invented one called roofing, which they would climb up scaffolding in the city centre on top of department stores and unfurl banners. And they could do this for about 10 minutes before the police would climb up after them and get them down. But that was enough to get a nice big crowd round them.
Yeah. And now the other movements are using that kind of action to.
Well, now flash mobs, and I mean,
yes.
yeah, I mean, some of these things. I was a bit sick. Somebody sent me a little YouTube clip of a flash mob, saying, "Oh, this is wonderful," and it was an orchestra that actually was doing a flash mob, and it was very nice. And then at the end, I saw sponsored by Sabadell.
Oh my God!
So, oh my God, this bank, which we are campaigning about with its evictions and all this stuff, and all these issues about banks that there are in Spain, and somebody says, "Oh, isn't this precioso?" It's about so. I mean, some of our forms of action get co-opted like that.
So we have to keep an eye open. Not everything that looks non-violent action is actually non-violent action, really.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.